seminar. Great to see all of you participating. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to the elders past and present. Today's speaker doesn't need much of an introduction to most of us. Stefan Kaufman, of course, is our beloved colleague in Behaviour work, a senior research fellow there. And in many ways, I would probably characterize Stefan as the personification of what MSDI stands for in many different ways. I think Stefan is generally interested in combining rigorous research with practical relevance. I think you've also enjoyed, like many of us, training in different types of disciplines, including a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Science, and a PhD in Human Ecology from Australian National University. And also before joining MSDI, already before finishing his PhD, Stefan worked for the Victorian Environmental Protection Agency for close to or over 10 years. So that's again sort of, I guess, exemplary for many of us in MSDI. So alongside all the work that Stefan has been doing over the past, including leading several missions within MSDI and Behaviour works, he's also been leading research on a paper, leading on the development of a paper that is quite close, I would say, to the heart of the current MSDI strategy, the interplay between behavioural change and systems change. And Stefan has been leading this work together with Zan and Shuin and Liam and myself as co-authors. I also like to think of this as an example of what you could call slow science, something that we don't have that much opportunity for within a context of.
We've just lost your audio, Rob. I don't know if you can hear.
I'm not sure what happened there. Someone put me on mute. Maybe I'm speaking too long.
So I think I'm back. We heard.
That's okay. But I still remember, Stefan, I think the first time I heard you presenting this paper was in a time you could still actually travel. This was in Ottawa at one of the Sustainability Transitions Research conferences. So that's an indication of how long we've been working on this and how long the ideas have been cooking. But also glad to say that I think it's pretty close now to being published. So just trying to get over the last hurdle. So Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob. I'll just share my screen. Well, thank you for the chance to share this this joint project with you all today. I'll jump right into it. You've set the scene very nicely, Rob. I'd like to acknowledge also that it's Are You OK today, and encourage people to get involved and also download some of the great Punny postcards and so on like this one. It's a very important theme, and I was reflecting this morning in the introductory talk how the interplay between individual experience and behaviour and context applies well beyond transitions to how people deal with stress and burnout and so on too. So perhaps you'll find some of the frameworks we're talking about useful from that point of view too later on, everyone. I guess where this paper comes from is an interest in how do we change all this, as a human living in Monash, in the People's Republic of Brunswick is my particular locality. The lands that I believe are called Bullockabek, or a place of grass and trees in the local Aboriginal language. And with the Monash University out there in the eastern burbs, in the demographic population centre of Monash, and we have these industrial and urban sprawl you can see right below us in that photo as well. And changing all of this is really my career interest in that human ecology to environmental regulation to behaviour works transition. And the thread that connects it for me is this interest in how humanity's co-evolution with our context shapes what's possible in terms of our behaviours and the futures that we create as we go. And again, as Rob alluded to, one of the wonderful things about joining MSDI, my checkered oddfish background is joined by many other oddfishes here. It's really great to have that culture of bridging theory and practice and different backgrounds people have. We're interested in changing systems, and I think we need to go beyond saying, yes, behaviour change is important, yes, systems change is important, and find ways to actually connect and supercharge each other through those connections. and indeed move beyond such a dichotomy. And I'm going to return to this as a bit of a thought experimental example later on in the talk, but all of this that I'm talking about has systems of production, systems of consumption. There are relationships and links between how we live our lives in a city like Melbourne, the coal mining in the Latrobe Valley, and no doubt a fair few Melburnians were part of the Bob Brown convoy that went up to Queensland during the last federal election protesting the Adani mine, which may or may not have made a difference to the outcome, but certainly indicated some of the cultural and political fault lines around changing all of this that exists out there. And so being able to understand and bridge these connections, I think, is very important if we're going to steer our civilization through what are some very challenging hurdles and narrow windows that we have over the next century or more. This interest, I guess, is shared by transitions literature. There's a recognition that there are systems of production and consumption that matter, and that actors' inactions and inactions affect each other across it. And there's a fantastic mosaic of different disciplinary perspectives and focal areas on it. But one thing that's pretty well acknowledged, I guess, is that there's a bit of a knowledge and research gap around everyday life and how it fits into these systems. And this is problematic because the evidence seems to be that simply greening the production side, decoupling energy, material, biodiversity impacts and so on from economic growth is not really happening at the scale it needs to. And at the same time, working only on the demand side, trying to promote greener lifestyles and the like is a lot of it is quite superficial and niche right now. We're not seeing the scale of change we need. And so it's not at all controversial, I think, in transitions scholarship nor to this audience to acknowledge that substantial change is needed in both production and consumption systems to achieve the changes we need to make. What I think is a little bit more controversial is this idea of focusing on everyday life. I think it raises a lot of red flags for people, and there's some reasonable concerns. The idea that the consumers are the problem and not other powerful actors is something that this Twitter burn up here, I think, does quite well in pointing the lens back at Shell. The Liberal National Government made a fair amount of hay out of the taking away the weekend elements of the electric vehicles policy that Labor brought to the last election, for example. And even when the latest IPC report came out, there was some reactions to the idea of individualizing and reducing the problem down to people. There's a political populism element of it, which we've seen very much here in Australia, but internationally has emerged as the Yellow Jacket movement in France and Canada. It was a big theme actually at the conference where we presented that early draft presentation in Canada. This concern of deflecting attention from the real problem, the incumbents' invested interests that might be driving things, and also a lot of interest and concern with phenomena like rebound and negative spillover, where we might see making things cheaper and less impactful might actually lead to increased uptake of them, or that people might be doing one good thing, but that leads to them forgiving themselves for doing others, which is also linked to ideas of moral budgeting, where people might feel they can do something a little bit naughty in one area because they're doing the right thing in others. All these things are raised potentially by this focus on everyday life, and that might be part of the reason why it's a bit of an empty spot in some of the transition literature. There's a preference to look at the production side and broader systems. And I guess more broadly still, there's a sort of, a set of preconceptions and assumptions about behaviour and behaviour change that you may have heard, that there's a tendency to focus on only observable actions, such as people planting roadside gardens or purchasing vehicles, that it's individual and largely about local and personal incentives and choices, that they're typically small impact, light bulb replacement versus, say, an aluminium smelter in terms of greenhouse emissions, and that behaviours are downstream from policy, technology and design, that things like uptake, adoption are common terms, that maybe perhaps that substantial personal change is too hard, and in short, that behaviour is a product of systems and not something that shapes them. And that, I think, leads to some of the thinking that you see here in this resource that the Australian Association of Environmental Education provides for grant recipients of the New South Wales Environment Trust, which somewhat awkwardly, I think, situates behaviour strategies as one of a number of themes, and perhaps tries to wean people away from only focusing on them. At least they actually recommend a palette of strategies. But for those of you who've been involved in more intensive behaviour change efforts and applied stuff, you'd probably agree that there are behavioural science applications to many of the so-called systemic strategies, and the distinctions are by nowhere near as sharp and direct as they might appear there. And I'm sure many of us would have views about what are weaker and stronger behavioural strategies in what context, when, and for whom as well. So there's these preconceptions, I guess, about behaviour, which might also be bleeding through into transitions perspectives. And so really, part of what we're trying to do in this paper and discussion is reframe behaviour as a source of insights and a focus of research and action, particularly that it's not just a focus on demand side and choices, and that but sustainability transitions literature might have a blank and blind spot in a few areas, such as the importance of understanding and changing the adaptivity or maladaptivity of behaviour in context, and how it has consequences at scales of the individual and up into different systems. That any person in any role can be looked at through a behavioural lens. Yes, consumers, but also the niche innovators who are trying to do things differently, and the powerful actors who might be variously supporting or opposing them, CEOs and politicians and so on. They all can be useful to look at from a behavioural lens. And yes, we do tend to focus on observable acts, but we do include decisions, and the specificity of looking at people in place and what they actually do, and letting that empirical and reality-focused feedback, I think, helps a lot with a bunch of theoretical and methodological challenges that happen in sustainability research. We can be very grounded in practical problems and places. And so the definition we use in this work is a very straightforward one from the Cambridge English Dictionary, that it's the way a person acts in a particular way in a particular situation under particular conditions. And we're contrasting this, I guess, with this blank and blind spot, if it exists, is happening at the same time that behavioural public policy has emerged as a really significant site of knowledge translation between research and policy. So back in 2010, a particularly influential paper by Elizabeth Show from a practice theory perspective articulated some quite reasonable concerns with the dominance of behavioural perspectives in climate policy in the UK at the time. And this, I would argue, was picking up a broader trend of the reaction of things like the formation of the UK Cabinet Nudge Office that was seen in a House of Lords inquiry. And indeed, there's been quite a lot of broader commentary and criticism about this emergence of nudge, but there's also 200 units or more across governments across Australia, and many of them here, and obviously Behaviour works closely with a bunch of them. And I think what's missing is that there is a more reflexive form of behavioural insights which tackles relevant problems for transitions. There's really interesting behavioural insights applicable to many of the arenas that transitions works within. It most definitely does not assume rational actors, which is one of the claims that Shove made, and very much is about understanding the bounded rationality and irrationality of decision making under many circumstances. And I think does pick up ideas of the co-evolution of behaviour and context. Importantly, it opens up closed government policy and programs to evidence, participation, and end-user focus. And I don't think it's a coincidence that often you'll see behavioural insights teams embedded with design thinkers, innovation specialists, and big data and so on. It's part of that sort of modernising and reforming public sector work. And I think it is entirely possible to point to better service and programs, and maybe potentially starting to influence better policy formulation, although I think that's acknowledged as a blind spot too. And this is some of what the transitions community might be missing as well. There's this significant policy movement narrative. And while many of the concerns that Shove and others raised in the early days are significant and are still present, there are some positive things going on too that could be useful to look at. So all of this is context, really. So we wanted to think about what does this mean for transitions, and particularly for locating behaviour in transitions. And so the review we set out to do was looking at what are the main perspectives engaging with behaviour and behaviour change in the literature. And given the emergence of this behavioural public policy phenomena, what are the implications of these perspectives for understanding and accelerating transitions? The way we went about this included some methods which would be quite familiar to my colleagues at BehaviourWorks in the more traditional rapid review and scoping review kind of family, but we also picked up more interpretive and narrative-based techniques, such as problematizing with guiding questions and using interpretive and iterative framework building, which I think was a useful combination of approaches, allowing us to, on the one hand, quickly survey and get a shape of the literature, and on the other, get some deep and rich insights that didn't try and rapidly aggregate and extract insights without understanding the complexities of what we were reading as well. Some of the guiding questions that helped that process, we were looking at what are the main treatments of behaviour, how do these perspectives address changing behaviour, how does it situate the behaviour in broader systems, and what are the implications for those research questions that sort of explodes out from those two main ones. What we found was that really, in terms of a focus on behaviour, it is indeed not very strongly there in the literature. There's nearly 3,000 papers were in the corpus that our search identified, which was essentially drawing on a string that's been used in a number of surveying reviews describing the transitions literature. And the most prominent perspectives are relatively critical of taking a behaviour change focus and looking at everyday life. So certainly the Shove example is the single most highly cited one, but other authors, and Gills's quote here is a good one that indicates that they tend to be more interested in things that go beyond what they see as technical fix or behaviour change. So again, taking some of that outside view of behaviour change that we introduced a little bit earlier on. When you looked at some of the more influential papers in that focus group of those that were dealing with behaviours, we were able to identify what we thought was maybe 4 perspectives that we then went and read further on and developed up. And so yes, there's this practice theory and somewhat ethnographic and bottom-up kind of approach that we saw that Shove and Maloney indicate. For example, there's what people in behaviour works and interested in psychology and social marketing might recognise in Ockwell's perspective. There's interesting stuff around evolutionary economics and habits in Marichal, and also this perspective around strategic points of view and the sort of negotiations and conflicts of different emerging niche and powerful actors in transitions as well. And so that, through a quite iterative and organic process of reading and rethinking and expanding, led us to identify these 4 perspectives that we're labelling, and they're just labels. We don't think that they've got hard edges, nor that they've exhaustively identified all the different variations, but we could see that there was work looking at what we would call reflective perspectives on behaviour, where behaviour is usually thought of as being one-off discrete actions. They're boundedly or irrational, and motivated and reflective people are actually thinking and choosing things to a degree, often occurring at the scale of small groups and individuals. There's this more automatic perspective where we're looking more at unconsidered repeated actions in response to socio-technical contexts. They can be socially structured habits, but also internally driven by cognitive biases and heuristics. And then we have this more strategic perspective of where we're looking more at instrumental action to influence others, advance interest, issues and causes, often the scale of organisations and institutions, and the everyday perspective where they're really not comfortable with the idea of behaviour as a minimal unit of analysis, but would probably, I hope, agree that they're poor representations of what are shared practices emerging from the interplay of internal and external structures between them. And what occurred to us, I guess, in this process is that they all have credibility and value. They all have been produced by thoughtful, intelligent people and applied to important problems. And so the opportunity here perhaps is to use them as different lenses to understand and look at the role of behaviour. Some of the observations we extracted from the guiding questions, there's this tendency for the reflective position to be contributed to by more psychological, economics, marketing, behavioural perspectives. You'll see terms that are like audience, target, action and context, adoption, diffusion, decisions in the literature. There's some interesting theoretical bridging and boundary concepts like strong structuration and bricolage in play. And again, this sort of focus more on the individual and interpersonal scale. Somewhat aligned but distinct is the automatic perspective. There's more of the evolutionary economics, behavioural economics flavour to it, cognitive sciences perhaps. We're looking at these repetitive, non-unconscious or locked-in paths of least resistance, and ideas of behavioural landscapes and moments that matter when habits are disrupted are significant in here as well. Strategic perspectives tended to be more aligned with political science, sociological, organisational psychology perspectives and disciplines. We see concepts of institutional influence, PR, citizen advocacy, Machiavellian positions, if you like, niche innovation and the like. And again, these are more in the collective multi-scale perspective. And then the everyday one, which is not purely practice theory. I think we'd also include some of the more anthropological and ethnographic perspectives in here too, but certainly this sort of bottom-up sense-making recognition of shared actions emerging from the interplay of internal and external structures. You'd see terms like sense-making, lifestyle practices, meanings, materials, competencies, co-evolution, organic, and some interesting concepts like energy cultures, habitus, forms of capital in there as well. So maybe this is all a bit abstract and dry, but you can apply these as lenses, like I said, to try and understand things. And we started this as an example of food waste, but after the planetary diet talk we had this morning, I quickly adapted it. So hopefully that worked. And apologies to Zan, who produced the food waste one in the first place. So if we looked at, if this goal is to have people eating diets that are healthy for them and healthy for the planet, you can look at that challenge and transition through these lenses in useful ways. So from the reflective perspective, you might be looking at how can you persuade people to try kangaroo or a better burger plant-based product instead of beef. And you might be hoping to get people in charge of meals for a household to make a list of based on planetary health diets before going to the store, for example. Recognizing the automatic perspective, you might recognize that there's a risk there, that you might buy things at random or at a whim without thinking about nights at home this week or how to cook, which is where quick bad decisions can lead to problems later on, very characteristic of the automatic perspective. And you could counter that perhaps by making sure that the more pro-planetary health products are there at eye height in high throughput aisles in the supermarket, the prime sales positions. From the strategic perspective, you might recognize problems with things like Uber Eats offering free food delivery to users who pay a monthly fee and sort of locking in some of that behavior. But you might also admire the insight and innovation of the Italian nonna or others who visit the store just before closing to get bargains on food that would otherwise be discarded, which if it is an Italian nonna might be more in that Mediterranean diet that we're being encouraged to in the planetary diet. And you might also look at how do you get supermarkets to substitute better food in those aisles in prime position instead of the ones that are just the most commercially viable or profitable ones. Then from the everyday perspective, we might be recognizing that things like having a well-stocked fridge, freezer and drinks fridge and pantry is a sign of status and food security. And even if this does lead to food going off, or that eating like a Mediterranean is a hell of a lot easier in a place like Brunswick where I live than it is in a outer suburb like Melton, where you have different access to food, different cultural backgrounds, and so on too. So, again, each of these are useful perspectives that adds insights and layers to understanding the challenge. So hopefully that's already beginning to show that there's practical application of identifying these 4 perspectives. But I want to elaborate that on a little bit further. So I suppose one of the motivations for the paper in the first place is that if we accept that behavioural public policy now is a major platform for knowledge translation, then behavioural scientists or policymakers looking to transitions, researchers and literature for help might be quite reasonably concluding that behaviour is not much covered, and where it is, it's critical, that there's not much to offer here. And if you agree that there are some good things and useful things there, and that behaviour is important and the everyday life scale is important in transitions, that's a problem. And more practically still, you could imagine that if, say, the Latrobe Valley Authority and Environment Victoria, who've been looking at the transition from the Latrobe Valley, came to us, that you'd hope we could provide some really useful advice and strategies drawing on the different perspectives to support those things. So they're trying to do things like help affected workers move into viable and sustainable alternative industries. They're trying to make sure that these massive holes in the grounds are remediated and turned to good purposes and so on. And there's a lot in it. And so through our 4 lenses again, we could be saying, and I should also add here, by the way, that when I was in Germany at the ISSS in 2019, there was a really interesting program of work in the Lusatia, if I'm pronouncing that right, region, which is another brown coal district in the east of Germany. And one of the examples here, the brick art down in the everyday perspective in the bottom right corner there, comes from them, where in their first year or so, they really spent this group of interdisciplinary researchers that were engaged by the German government to help with that transition. They spent time sitting there and listening and not trying to drive change or work out solutions, but just listen. And one of the things they observed in that process was a lot of the furloughed and unemployed workers were building all these interesting sculptures with these backyard brick sheds that are very common in the region. and they're like, huh, maybe there's something we can do with that. And one of the ways they tried to engage with and connect with these workers, who are obviously a key group within the transition, was to try and get them to enter their backyard brick art into this competition, and have it recognised in the local museum in Karlsruhe, the local city. And so, the everyday perspective might help you detect such a phenomena and connect with it and understand it. But maybe the reflective perspective would help you then say, well, how do we connect with and amplify that, reach other people, get them to join the competition and get involved in the brick art gallery. From the automatic perspective, we might be saying what bias and heuristics and habits are in play here. What are the moments that matter when we might have more opportunity to change than others? And that could very practically be applied in Behaviour. We have this Inspire framework for more effective written communication, which applies a bunch of nudges. So maybe you'd apply that to letters and communications to workers to try and get them to sign up to a retraining program, and also think about when to send it on that basis. The strategic perspective would be important all through this, if nothing else, to help win funding to do these things, and having an institutional and political analysis can help get the resources required to do it. You can look at how the departing industry could be persuaded to assist in the transition, or how new industries might be motivated to help the emerging ones. And there's also something that, again, the Germans were very concerned about, was this: how do we stop people in that region feeling alienated and turning away from mainstream society, getting involved particularly in far right extremism, but also in rejecting some of the sustainability direction, which again in the international context tends to be yellow jackets, but I think we see that here. And in the Latrobe Valley, they have some great things where they're getting some of the retrained workers to make solar hot water heaters as earth workers, which is probably preferable to joining far right extremist groups. I think most would agree. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a practical sense of how these different lenses can help us, yes, look at behaviour and individuals and everyday scales, but take into account quite different analyses and perspectives. And I half jokingly and half seriously propose that this is a form of transitions behaviour understandoscope, to borrow Michael Lunig's cartoon here, where each of these perspectives, of this complex dynamic reality is to a degree highlighting and obscuring different useful things, and they're stronger together and in complement to each other than they are with any one dominating things. And this is very much the idea of C. Wright Mill's sociological imagination. And to abstract it slightly further again, if we think about sometimes behaviour is theorised as relatively once-off, effortful and reasoned, deliberative and conscious. That seems to be more aligned with the reflective and strategic perspectives. Or if we think of it as being more repetitive, easy, intuitive and reactive and unconscious, that seems to be more aligned with the everyday and automatic perspectives. They have their favoured scales and theoretical constructs. The automatic and reflective seem to be more grounded in the micro and internal and interpersonal, whereas the strategic and everyday either focus more at institutional structural or in the case of the everyday, I think, reject that kind of more hierarchical analysis and have a fairly flat analysis of things. And I suppose what's really interesting to me is that, it seems to me that as we recognise these perspectives and situations cycling through, as people become aware of and want to change behaviours, are there opportunities for reflexive deliberation on behaviour and context, where we can understand, influence and change the different systems that are constraining and enabling behaviour in quite intentional ways. And equally, when we're looking at what's holding undesired behaviours in place, and or how do we sustain and embed behaviours, can we recognise that in the everyday and automatic perspectives that there's opportunities to reproduce broader processes and structures or disrupt them. In terms of future directions and discussion points, these are challenges and important not just within ST. Behavioural public policy, as I said before, is not perfect, and indeed the more progressive and reflexive perspective is not the dominant one, I would say. I think many of Schrove's and others' criticisms still hold very true for a lot of behavioural insights teams. But it is acknowledged that they've been through a bit of a reflection and rebuild period, and perhaps engaging with some of the same challenges and thoughts that the ST perspectives would help the broader behavioural public policy dialogue as well, and lead to better government and better policy ultimately. And I think, whatever the nature of the problem, we can sort of think about how these different perspectives layer up and help us consider when does taking a behaviour first perspective become part of the problem or part of the solution. And I think there's some really interesting thinking that Newton advanced about different horizons of transitions, where there's the here and now, where there's probably many behaviour changes possible, but they're often about optimizing and substituting. And this might allow us to improve things relatively fast and cheaply, but could also risk prolonging the horizon by reducing pressure to change. Conversely, we could also acknowledge that, you know, small changes in behaviour can lead to big tipping points in systems, and there might be opportunities to leverage some of those bigger points. And certainly I would say that the barriers and drivers that we encounter, particularly for more radical changes at this level, suggest socio-technical changes that we might want to engineer to help things happen. And you know, it's a sort of radioactive dye in the system, if you like, about what keeps sustainable behaviours relatively marginal. And as you move up to Newton's second horizon, where we're beginning to see the signs of change, there are shifts in some of the structural and contextual things restricting behaviour. Can we see behaviours from early adopters and niche innovators that are desirable and consistent with a low emissions or a low waste future, and translate and scale them? And again, can we get insights into those strategic insights and barriers? And when we look at the future state, you know, the major change where we have a very low emissions or low impact future, it might be difficult to forecast which behaviours, but it should be possible, and this is an idea of Liam's, that there should be behaviours that are possible now, that are possible in that future too, that we really want to understand and promote. We've talked about teleworking as one, for example. That might be a behaviour that is possible to do now and would be consistent with that very different future. And tracing that thread through might be a very useful thing. But other behaviours might be inconceivable before they emerge and require prototyping experimentation. And yeah, I'm not at all sure, and I'm sure further research and exploration will refine this. But one, I think there's probably a scale of whether you're dealing with simple through to complicated to complex behaviour change challenges in that transition across the horizons. And I also think there might be more natural contributions or fits from some other perspectives that may or may not align, as I've indicated here, that you know, we have a lot to offer maybe from the automatic and reflective space in the Horizon 1 to Horizon 2, but perhaps we need to draw more strongly on Horizon strategic and everyday perspectives, Horizons 3 and 2. And now I've been talking for nearly half an hour, so trust me, I'm going to stop soon. So really, I hope you can see that there's a real interest here in what are the respective strengths and weaknesses of the forward behaviour approaches, and we see tensions and opportunities there. You know, I think an interesting question that we could start with discussion, but I'm happy to take any questions, and indeed the whole author panel is here, I believe, so we can hopefully answer most questions. But yeah, is there a sandbox MSDI initiative in which we could experiment with applying these multiple perspectives? And one very practical challenge that's on my mind is how do you overcome the resource disciplinary duplication tax? You know, if it's hard enough to get even one social scientist involved in some initiatives, how do you sustain having 4 representatives, and is that the way to do it? And more conceptually and theoretically, you know, there are risks and challenges here around, you know, quite serious and important ontological, epistemological, and methodological differences between perspectives. So we could end up in a critical deadlock, or we could end up with brushing over them and a very superficial integration, which ignores important challenges and differences too. And it does make me think that maybe, you know, looking at complementarity rather than integration and transdisciplinarity might be worth thinking about. But, you know, very interested in people's thoughts about that. And this raises to me a quite funny Dilbert cartoon, I think, which I'm imagining different social scientists sitting around a table trying to work out nice things to say about each other's perspective. You know, would it look something like this potentially? I believe Rob's comments on this was that social scientists are more likely to use each other's toothbrush than different disciplinary frameworks or something like that. That kind of, so it's not easy stuff, but like I said, I think there are opportunities and values to doing it. So over to you, discussion, and thank you. Remember, yeah, try and have a great day today as well, and we welcome questions and comments.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stefan. Well done, and also introducing several ongoing ideas that are not yet in the paper. So I think there's a continued scope for further work along some of these thoughts.
Yeah.
Would you mind stop sharing your screen, perhaps? And I'm happy to open up the floor for any questions or comments.
Oh,
Yeah, we got a few.
okay.
So
Simone, why doesn't Simone go first?
yeah, Simone, you go.
Thank you. That
And
was
then
really
Tony.
informative. I missed the first part, so you may have mentioned this before, so please excuse me if not. I was just wondering whether you've done the lens of those 4 quadrants and which one has the best longer term impact.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think if you take that sort of Newton horizons kind of angle on things, they could be thought of as a progressive set of lenses and pathways to get to longer impacts. But yeah, I think it's a really it's an open question, I guess. But I suspect the answer is not any one of them. It's really the combination of them. But I think that does need to be demonstrated. It's not something we could say with confidence right now.
And he could take like from residential, just in regards to Justin's appointment tomorrow. If you could just give me a call back on number.
Sorry, is that?
I think someone needs to mute. Sounds like
that was not a question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simona. Tony, I think you wanted to ask a question as well.
Yeah, well done, Stefan and the whole team. It's great to see this getting close to publication. It's a really important piece of work. And as I think I mentioned earlier to some of you, I know that the International Science Council in Paris is very interested in this nexus between human behaviour change and system change. Stefan, it was terrific to have you involved in some work with them recently. My question was around whether you've been able to present this to a group of thoughtful policy people and get any reactions from them around the value of it to this point.
I haven't looked at the full participant list today, so it'd be interesting to know if there was any policy people online. No, so far, a very early version of this was presented at the International Sustainability Transitions Conference in Ottawa in 2019, and I would expect that audience was almost entirely scholars, wasn't it? But I imagine there'd be a few more applied people there as well. I suppose, yeah, to my thinking so far, I guess this has been a paper and narrative aimed primarily at the transitions community, but that does include people working very much in the practice and policy area too. So yeah, I think it's a logical next testing ground, isn't it?
Yeah, I just wonder. I mean, I think it's terrific where you've already got to, but it'd be interesting just to hear some responses from people who are challenged by these big policy blockages. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Tony. Yep, Darren, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thanks so much, Stefan, for that great presentation. Given the, the 4 lenses and the ontological and epistemological kind of differences that you've pointed out, I was wondering, maybe can you just sort of expand a bit on the challenges, I suppose, of evaluation within that sort of context? How do you get at evaluation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I like to use the definition of evaluation as being judgments of the value or merit or worth of an activity or initiative, and if you add to that one definition, I seem to be using dictionary definitions a lot right now. One definition of knowledge that I think is quite good is justified true belief. Then there are going to be quite different views as to what is worthwhile and interesting evidence about behaviour change and changes in transitions on a given situation, depending on which of those perspectives you strongly adhere to. I would, I guess, add that we are trying to advocate for a sort of mutual acceptance rather than disciplinary culture warrior kind of mode, and that is detectable in some of the commentary writing about these perspectives. And certainly in my experience as a fairly interdisciplinary trained person working in behaviour change with places like Behaviour Works, it doesn't have to be that way. There are ways to draw on these different perspectives and integrate them in useful ways that possibly would make some of the really deep theoretical and methodologically trained people in the different contributing disciplines fume, but seem to work and seem to get us to good places. So again, I guess this sits in that tension between how do we somehow sit between critical deadlock on the one hand, where we just refuse to communicate and see the value of these different perspectives, versus more superficial integration and duplication. But to go more practically to your question, I suppose an obvious thing is to try and explicitly build in contributions from the different perspectives and try and work out, do they layer out and help each other in saying, is this a worthwhile or effective initiative that we're examining? This is probably the first step. Yeah, and I think nothing proves like doing, right? So we should try and do it. See from there. And indeed, I'm sure there are examples where people have done this quite well already that I might not be aware of yet too.
Does that answer your question, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to pick it up offline. Maybe, Stefan, we can keep talking, and with obviously everyone here. I think it's a really fascinating thing to ponder.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it also runs up, I mean, I raised that practical issue of, multiple disciplinary duplication tax, if you like, because, the one time I did try and get, as a commissioning policy and regulation person, to get behavioural scientists and practice theorists to work together, it ended up having to be 2 parallel projects. So it wasn't quite what I wanted in terms of getting that conversation going, where we're trying to address a problem from both perspectives. So yeah, I think there's work to be done there on how do we overcome and integrate or complement the perspectives.
Rachel.
Thanks, Stefan. Great to hear about your work, and I guess kind of speaking to what you were just talking about then about the demonstration and the interventions and things. I'm in our cities team at Climate Works, and through a lot of our systems mapping, it really came up a lot around this kind of like consumptions and lifestyles. And if you kind of cut emissions data in a different way, as opposed to by sector, if you kind of look at the cityscape and the emissions that are generated through people living in this kind of area and the kind of consumption habits of them, it generally shows much higher emissions and is a different way to kind of capture, communicate about what the problem is. So that kind of came up a lot. So I find I was, keen to kind of hear your conversation today around, well, then what's the second part of that around the solutions, and, what do we do about that, and how can we, kind of speaking to Darren's question, engage some of those policymakers, which, we are now through our program, through my work on transport and, others on buildings. And we do kind of have that sector specific approach, but we kind of exist within a broader cities team. And so how do we kind of bridge those gaps and, find interventions that will kind of cut across or have ripple effects across, broader than just our kind of bucket. So I don't necessarily have a question, but I was just, keen to kind of keep this discussion. I know you've had some chats with Margot, and I see she's not on the call today. She's probably got more questions and thoughts, but there's opportunities for us to kind of work out, well, how do we, if we've defined a bit about the problem, how do we work on some of these kind of interventions and opportunities and things going forward, as in sandpitting it, as you were kind of talking about.
Thanks for the interest, and it sounds like we're hitting on some relevant themes at least. I think there's a lot of wisdom in the transition scholarship around place-based and urban experimentation, because it does bring together so many different layers of the problem and levels. So I mean, it's a pretty obvious answer, I guess, in some ways, but looking at a particular problem or place and trying to bring together these different perspectives to solve that, how do we help a place like Melton on the fringes of Melbourne, or Penrith in Sydney, or something like that, achieve certain key transitions? I think you would be forced to, look at some of those layered up challenges and the value of different perspectives in addressing them. That's one answer, I guess. But I think that's where I'll leave it for now. But let's talk more. Yeah.
Liam.
Yeah, hi. So Steph, thanks for presenting it. It's I've been on this journey for quite some time. I was just reflecting on, as you're presenting, whether there's an audience, a target audience dimension to the perspectives as well. So, is it true that some people see the individuals in society as needing to drive transition, whereas other perspectives are more focused on decision makers, policy makers, institutional change, the like? Is that division seems to fall out, but I just wanted your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think, yeah, again, I'd say the edges are soft and porous, not hard, but yeah, I do think certainly in the reflective and automatic perspectives tends to be, but not always, aimed at larger groups. But yeah, there is some really interesting scholarship around biases and heuristics in decision making of policymakers and business leaders as much as there are in mass populations, for example. And similarly, you know, I think the strategic perspective and the everyday perspective tends to sort of look at collectives and groups of people, and particularly as they're bound up in different social structures and processes as well. So they tend to go for those larger and broader groups, but you know, maybe would reject the idea that you should look at an individual decision maker in isolation and that they need to be understood as part of a network of influences and so on. But you know, some of the recent work by Paul Upham and others has really emphasised the value of applying that kind of individual lens to some of those powerful decision makers too. So I think it might be one of those exception proves the rule things. So I think, yes, your observation is broadly correct, but there's some really interesting stuff that happens when it goes the other way as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also links between them as well. So if I think about, you know, and you sort of outline this, that, you know, we might take an individual perspective early, and if we get behaviour change, that might lead to policy support or putting pressure on institutions or governments to change. And so, you know, that transitions from perspectives through the transition is actually a really, and the audience that becomes the target of that, I think, is also another layer that we can explore as we head forward. Yeah,
and having those different sort of perspectives in your toolkit, I think, would allow you to have that flexibility rather than being locked into any one. Now, I think we had a question in the chat.
Yeah, question by Abby, but I think Liam has already asked the question from a different perspective. I think Abby is asking whether the lenses can also be useful in identifying which kind of actors or stakeholders are relevant in, I guess, in a particular transition problem. So for some actors, you might choose a certain perspective, or a certain perspective might be better equipped to address the particular challenge or the problem than another perspective. Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I think I'm reminded of one of the formative experiences for me was following an academic around at ANU as he was trying to promote this thing called the Earth Charter, which was a sort of soft law document of different values and principles. And I got to listen to him talk to politicians and to business leaders and community groups and things like that about it. And there was different variations from all of them about, you know, the politicians were saying, well, if you could just show me that there's a constituency who want to vote for policies in this direction, then I can probably do something with it. And the businesses saying, you know, would this be a viable business proposition for us, and could we get behind it? And community groups saying, well, people would like to do this kind of stuff, but the policies and the economic structures are too hard. So I find it hard to say that in any one case there's just one perspective, but I do think, you know, if you just look at where these different perspectives and the disciplines contributing to them tend to get the most grist, you know, where they focus their attention, I guess it does sort of imply that there's valuable stuff there as a starting point. Maybe that's a clue as to where they are at their strongest, but that could also be an accident, I guess. We might actually find out new things by applying them in totally different areas. But so no, that's a bit of a non-answer, really. I find it hard to separate different actors and perspectives in any given situation in the abstract, I guess. And I think it'd be really interesting to look at a given case and then think it through and explore it.
Yeah, I would probably put on my hat as co-author now. I would probably agree with that. So I think that the frameworks or the lenses are not necessarily tied into particular actors, but they can be tied into particular research questions. I mean, any type of actor can be analyzed through each of the four lenses, depending on what question someone is interested in. I mean, individuals or households or the typical sort of actors that are studied, for instance, in the everyday behaviors could also be acting strategically, trying to influence policy through social networks and so on. So, and at the same time, a CEO or someone that might be looked at from a strategic perspective usually can also be studied in terms of what are the patterns or other types of automated behaviors that individual demonstrates in his day-to-day work environment. So you can actually study it you can study certain each of the actors from each of the lenses.
Yeah, I'd agree with
but
that.
I think there's more work that we could do in terms of what are the types of research questions that can be best addressed with each of the 4 lenses, or a combination of all the 4 lenses.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, Stefan, and this is sort of, could you reflect a little bit on behavior works and the perspectives within behavior works often used for projects done there, and is there any, would you say some of these lenses are more prominent or more often used in behavior works projects, and might somewhat be more missing or not that much represented in the work, and is that an issue? If so, and what would that mean for, I don't know, maybe even your hiring policies, if you like? Do you need more political scientists or social scientists working in behavior works on a behavioral change perspective?
That's a great question, and I'm sure Liam will have a view on this as the director. But I guess my observation is that the go-to toolkit is probably, I think it is not insignificant that when behavior works was being conceived and emerging in 2010-11, we had Liam and Jim as they were the researchers in it, and they were coming from, I would say, a fairly reflective kind of background, social psychology, sustainable tourism kind of background. And then, it was partly at the same time and in response to the emergence of nudge and the behavioral economics perspective. And, Liam and I and others have had many half joking, half annoyed conversations about how half of behavioral economics is borrowing insights from psychology and things like that. But I think that led to some deliberate inclusion and hiring of more behavioral insights and economics perspectives in the group. And me as a more sociologically and multidisciplinary perspective thing, I think Liam and others have valued that as a contribution and made some deliberate hires in that space as well, more strategic and everyday perspectives even, perhaps. We probably don't have any, I don't think we say we have any hardcore practice theorists in the group, that's for sure, but certainly people who are sympathetic and interested in those views. So I'd say our toolkit is primarily in the reflective and automatic space. There is an openness and inclusion of some people with the perspectives in the other disciplines and in the other perspectives, but maybe that also reflects perhaps the opportunity in MSGI more broadly to build on that depth. And is there, if there's a T-shaped researcher, is there a T-shaped institutional unit perhaps? I don't know. Interesting question. Liam, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, I just really concur. I mean, we've made and have tried to make some strategic hires in the past. I mean, we tried to hire Yolandi Stringers a while ago, and and others who very much come from different perspectives. I think we're open. I think we're very. The one trait we look for, I wouldn't look for in a staff member, is someone that's a discipline zealot. I think because we work with clients, we need to listen to them, we need to understand their needs, and we need to think about, if we've got a fairly broad toolkit, then we are better able to make judgments about where they're at and what perspectives might be more useful for them. So I think there is a bit of the T-shaped researcher in all of the behaviour work staff, and it's something we've really recruited and encouraged in the work we've done. So would argue we would help to have more people with practice perspectives. Yes, we've got the transitions group that you lead, Rob, that we're intersecting more and more with. So we're learning and both ways there. So I think we're in a good space. But sessions like this and work like this is just so important, not only for MSDI but behaviour works as well, in terms of broadening our understanding and thinking more broadly in terms of how we solve problems for the people we work with.
And for those of you who are not familiar with the T-shaped researcher, that's something I believe Rebecca Brown coined, or at least has published on, as I've seen. And the idea of you have to have disciplinary and content depth as a researcher to offer, but also be able to play nicely with others and work with others, and that's the crossbar of the T, if you like. So you could see some analogy between that and a whole organizational unit too, perhaps, I would think.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Shireen?
Just a quick follow-up on that, Stefan and Liam, because you pretty much answered it more from the structure of behavior works and the composition of the team and the staff that you have. I was curious, is there emphasis on the reflective and automatic behavior, as you mentioned, Stefan? Is that also something that is also coming from your external funders, so the kind of industry partners and stakeholders that you are engaging with? Is it something that for them also, those are the kind of questions that they're asking, as opposed to, for example, the strategic behavior?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a bit chicken and egg. Yeah, like I said, when I was on the government side of the table, just because of my particular background and interest, I somewhat mischievously and deliberately tried to get the behaviour works to work with practice theorists. It was your lady stringers, as it happens. So I guess that's a counter example, if you like, that there's this desire to try and get it. But I think it would be logical to say that, you know, where the dominant narratives on behavioural insights are fairly in the nudge and automatic space, that's what people expect. That'd be true. I think our consortium model somewhat mitigates against that, because we as well as a lot what has increasingly become a lot of one-off and consultancy style work, we've also had these long-running partnerships with agencies, and I think that's allowed for much more, I guess, holistic and considered tackling your problems with different bites at them over time and different approaches too. So that might mitigate against it too. But I think it's a really insightful point. You know, and I'm thinking here of Pierre Bourdieu and Homo academicus and so on. You know, he's there's very good reason to think that funding sources and disciplinary outlets and so on do shape the kinds of questions that can be asked and answered. So it'd be astonishing if it wasn't the case that it had some role in it. But I do think it's quite, you know, I guess the good and exciting thing about working with practice and people dealing with real world problems is that unless you're very, very insulated from what's really going on, you can't afford to take too narrow, out of touch perspectives on things. And, you know, I think that's why you do get these interesting kludgy teams in government departments of design thinkers and behavioural insights and innovation and big data and so on, all coming together because they recognise the value of combining those different perspectives as well. So, yeah, really interesting question.
And just add a very quick point to that, Shirin. I think the answer is largely yes. And Steph rightly points out that the consortium arrangement we have that's had long-standing partnerships has allowed us to bring different perspectives. And we see that really strongly in our board. So our board tend to think a much bigger picture, much more in transitions, and they give us license to do things within the partnership. Sometimes the translation from that to the staff we work with is a struggle. Because they're probably thinking differently, and so there is this tension, but it's a tension we embrace, but it is important that the board and the more strategic thinkers in government who sit on that board give us license to do that kind of thinking.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Thanks everyone. We've run out of time. I guess in the end, the proof is in the eating of the pudding. I think is the saying. So it would be really great. I think one of your earlier suggestions, Stefan, to have a project where we could actually apply the 4 lenses to look at the same research problem from different perspectives and see where that will lead us. And it would be really interesting to see, I think in particular from sort of a policy recommendation perspective, what will come out of those 4 lenses and whether those are complementary or contradictory or competing for similar resources for follow-up, which might then raise questions on what is more important than the other. So there might be limits to the extent at which they can be combined or integrated, in particular from a recommendation perspective. But I think that's something for us to find out in a follow-up project. Yep. I would like to thank Stefan and particularly for a great presentation, Stefan, and as always, and everyone for joining this seminar. And I hope to see you next time. And have a great Are You OK day.
Thank you. And I literally couldn't have done this without the co-author team. So thank you to everyone here and all the great questions as well.